classifications of clergy in the United Methodist Church, and there are several. And then there is another handout that talks about what is required for those who are pursuing ordination in the United Methodist Church. So we're going to go through all that tonight, because tonight we are talking specifically about ordination and polity and structure of the United Methodist Church, which I expect to be riveting. But I'm glad that you're here for it. It's nice to know how the church is structured, and as a part of a course on the United Methodist Church, it's helpful to know that, especially if you serve on committees, and there are many of us who do, because it's nice to know how all of that fits together. When you just step into the church, it's really hard to understand that. So I hope tonight will be enlightening for you. Hope it'll give you the opportunity to see how things fit together, and how we go about doing what we're doing, and also help you better understand what clergy are and how clergy become clergy. We have people in every congregation I've ever been in who are considering that process, so there's good information there. I'm going to go ahead and open us up with prayer, and then we'll let anybody who wants to join us just come and join us. If you are somebody who's watching the radar, please feel free to do that. I will not be offended if you look at your phone, and nobody else will either, and let us know if there's anything we need to know about. Let's pray together. Gracious and giving God, thank you for today. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. Thank you for the rain. We pray for your protection. We're thankful for the blessing. Father, we just pray that your Holy Spirit would be present in this place tonight, that you would guide us according to your will, that you would guide our conversation, so that as a result of our time together tonight, we might know you better. And this we ask in your name. Amen. Okay, thanks for coming. So tonight I want to answer some of your questions about how the church is structured. So we're looking at, tonight in particular, we're looking at the structure of the United Methodist Church and the ordination process and the different classifications of clergy. And next week we will talk about what the doctrine of the United Methodist Church is about how we relate to the rest of the world. And we have that. Every church, every established church has a doctrine about that. So we're going to talk about that next week. And then we're going to talk the following week about what is called the Wesleyan quadrilateral. That's something that is unique to us, to Wesleyan denominations. There are more Wesleyan denominations than just the United Methodist Church. But we subscribe to this idea that has come to be called the Wesleyan quadrilateral, where we analyze our faith through the lens of Scripture, tradition, reason, and experience, with Scripture being primary among those four. So we'll talk about that in the last week, and then we'll be done with our time together. I'm going to be taking a look this coming fall at the best time to offer a Bible study. And so I'm going to be putting a survey out to you at the end of this course, and also on Sunday morning, and your feedback would be really helpful to me, so that we can schedule a time that meets as many needs as we can in that one time slot. All right, I want to talk first about the structure of the United Methodist Church, and then we're going to talk about the ordination process. Now, the schedule that I've given you follows kind of in order the articles of faith that are in the Book of Discipline. So you're going to see things on that schedule like the marriage of ministers and rites and rituals and things like that. And a lot of that is a carryover from the dialogue that the Anglican Church was having with itself, the Church of England, when it was breaking away from the Roman Catholic Church. And a lot of that dialogue was just, as I've read to you before, copied over into the Articles of Faith of the Methodist Church, because Wesley was an Anglican priest, so he just took a lot that was in the Book of Common Prayer and copied much of it verbatim. So, as you're probably aware, Roman Catholic priests are celibate, and Anglican or Episcopalian priests, however you want to look at that, are not. They're allowed to marry. And so consequently, United Methodist ministers are also allowed to marry. Now, that doesn't seem like it is an odd thing to us, because we've been doing this for a couple hundred years. But it was an important point for those who were putting the faith together. Were we going to have clergy who were celibate, or were we going to have clergy who were allowed to be married? If you have any questions about that, I'd love to answer them. Usually when I receive questions about that, they're more along the lines of, why do some denominations not allow their ministers to marry? And there really aren't very many who don't allow that. Even in the Roman Catholic Church, there was the practice of clergy to marry for a very long time. There was one pope, and I'd have to look up his name, but there was one pope who wanted to reform the church, the Roman Catholic Church, in more of the style of the monasteries. Monasteries were very popular throughout Christendom for quite some time. Beginning with the 4th century, they gained in popularity for about the next 500 or 600 years. And so this pope had a belief that there was not a lot of discipline amongst the clergy. And he thought that because the monks seemed to be more disciplined, that it would be better for the clergy not to marry. And so clergy who were married at that time were allowed to stay married, and anybody who was not married could not get married. And if you were married and your spouse passed away, you could not remarry. And then from that point on, the Roman Catholic Church had included a vow of celibacy in the rites that the priests go through. This most recent pope has been having dialogue about whether or not that will continue. Now, that doesn't affect us at all, save that when the Church of England was separating from the Roman Catholic Church, that was an issue. Are the priests in the Anglican Church going to marry, or are they not going to marry? Naturally, the priests wanted to marry. There's a very large group of priests in the Roman Catholic Church who would like to marry. There are a number of letters that have been written, and you can read articles about this, to Pope Francis, asking for the ability to marry. So typically, clergy want to do that because people who don't want to marry don't have to get married, but those who want to marry want to be able to marry. So it was decided in the United Methodist Church that we would retain that practice from our Anglican forebears and allow clergy to get married. Do you have any questions about that?
I know that sometimes when you ask modern Catholics, they don't say that it's a stricture, less an optional vow that they can take. Is that still the case, or is it still part of their ordination?
I do not believe that is an optional vow. Some of you who have been Catholic may know that better than I do, but I don't believe that's optional.
What is the racial specs on Methodist elders being married?
How many of them are married? I have never seen a statistic about that. That's not something that gets tracked in our statistical data tables, so I have no idea. I don't know that anybody even tracks that. It'd be interesting to know. I've seen a lot of stats. I've never seen that one. I could tell you that, gosh, as far as stats like that about clergy, what we track most frequently are ethnic breakdowns and gender breakdowns. And we've just arrived at a place where in the near future, there might very well be more female clergy than male clergy in the United Methodist Church. We're real close to that. Yeah.
In modern Catholicism, if you are married and decide to become a Catholic priest, are you allowed to stay married?
Okay, so I had a conversation with the priest about this last fall, because the Catholic Church goes through a catechism, and Kate and I were thinking about sitting through that just because we never had before, and we wanted to get some of our questions answered, so it made it more helpful when I teach things like this. But so I was talking to a priest about this, and he said, you can find poorly written blog posts online that say that you can do that. But what he told me, and this was the man, the priest who is responsible for vocations in the Oklahoma City Diocese, and in the Roman Catholic and Orthodox Church, that means the clergy, becoming a clergy person. He said that typically the only way they normally allow for that is if you are already an Orthodox priest and you are married and want to become a Roman Catholic priest. He said other than that, they typically don't allow for that. Then I talked to another priest who said that when the Anglican Church, the Episcopal Church split, the previous pope created a way for disgruntled Episcopalians to come into the Roman Catholic Church in mass, like a whole congregation could come in. And he said that at that time, if the Episcopal clergy person were married, they were allowed to stay married and become a Catholic priest. But then if their spouse died, they couldn't get remarried. Those are the only two times I've ever spoken with a priest, and that's the answer I got.
Do you think they don't marry because Jesus didn't marry? Or there's no evidence that Jesus married?
That might be a better question for somebody with more experience with the Roman Catholics than I do. My take on that from my limited experience with them is that it has more to do with, they do have a robust theology about the idea that they are married to the church. But when I was in seminary, and that's why I can't remember the name of the guy, because that was when I studied this, and I read about that transition in the Roman Catholic Church. What I read about said that it really had more to do with a perceived lack of discipline and a desire to bring more discipline to the ranks of the clergy. My suspicion is that the idea that that clergy are married to the church developed as a justification for a desire to increase discipline. But that's just my take on it.
I think they also reference where Paul was talking about if you can't control yourself,
Then it's good to get married.
You should be focused on God. I've heard say that, use that as well.
Yeah, Peter says something too about how it's better not to be married. And as the scholars that have written about that particular theology of celibacy have also noted that there's a major change. When they were first preaching, the apostles were first preaching, there was this belief that Christ was coming again really, really soon. He was going to come again in their lifetime. And as the Christians, Christ followers at that time began to die and Christ hadn't come back yet, they had to kind of modify their theology about eschatology, which means the end of time when Christ is coming again. So you see, in particular, you see a lot of Paul's theology change from a kind of an imminent return to well, it may be a while, and so let's figure out how to run this race and run it well kind of a theology. So the justifications, I think, though, definitely are used in terms of the idea that clergy should be celibate. Good questions. What else can I help you with? Okay. All right. So let's move on to a couple of other things. Now, rites and rituals. What you see on your schedule about rites and ceremonies or rites and rituals, can't remember exactly how it's listed, basically is a teaching that in the United Methodist Church, we do not have to, every United Methodist Church does not have to have exactly the same order of worship as every other United Methodist Church. Locally, we have the ability to make changes, and in the discipline it says, make changes according to where you are and according to the times. And that was written a very long time ago, back in the 1700s. So we have authority to make changes to the order of worship. Now, the Book of Discipline also... the Book of Discipline gives that authority to the clergy in the United Methodist Church. It's the responsibility of ordering worship falls on the clergy person. In many churches, while the Book of Discipline does not structure a worship committee, so there's not a requirement in the Book of Discipline that we have a worship committee, most clergy in the United Methodist Church will form a worship committee anyway so that there is congregational input into the worship process. But what the teaching in the Book of Discipline says is that we don't have to be the same. And that is also a carryover from the dialogue between the Church of England and the Catholic Church when there was a split. The Church of England was basically saying we don't have to do everything exactly the same way as every other church. Now, do we have a book of worship? Yes. For them, it would have been a book of common prayer. Do we have that? Yes. But we have the authority to make some modifications. In particular, the United Methodist Church has always been affirming of the idea that we have what is called a free pulpit. That doesn't mean that we're glad that we don't have to pay to preach. What it means is that the clergy person is free to preach whatever they feel like God has put on their heart to preach, which means that I don't get a message from the bishop or something like that I have to read to you as my sermon on Sunday morning. What Methodists like about that is that gives us the opportunity to have a prophetic pulpit, which means that there is an opportunity to preach without fear of retribution from the hierarchy about what we are preaching. So if there is a bishop who has a different set of political or theological convictions as from the clergy person who's preaching, the person in the pulpit doesn't have to worry about retribution for not agreeing with everything that the bishop says. Now, again, that's not a huge issue to us either. It is a fairly big issue to the clergy. It's nice to have that. But that is, again, a result of the dialogue between the Church of England and the Roman Catholic Church back when that split happened that carried over into Methodism. And so we have that freedom to modify rites and ceremonies as necessary according to the place and according to the time and according to the people. But that same paragraph in the Book of Discipline says that we have to be very careful not to do something in our rites and ceremonies that is contrary to the doctrine and polity of the United Methodist Church. So what that means is this, that the discipline says that I am not allowed, for instance, to host a worship service of another faith led by another minister without permission from my district superintendent. So we can do that, but I have to have permission from the district superintendent. So that means that now that does not apply to issues where we are in, or relationships where we're in full communion with another denomination. Full communion is an ecumenical theological term that means two denominations have said we're not going to merge, but we believe that we have enough in common that we say that what you do is okay and you say that what we do is okay. Your clergy can administer our sacraments. We can swap pulpits if we want to. Parishioners can feel free to participate in rites and ceremonies in either kind of church. So if we're one of those denominations that we're in full communion with, we can do that without asking. Anybody else, we have to ask permission, and the district superintendent or the bishop have to grant permission to do that. That would be fine for any other Christian denomination. If Southern Baptist Church wanted to come and do something in our church, like say their church was destroyed in a tornado, we would definitely want to do that, but by discipline, I would just have to get the DS to say, sure, that's fine. There's nothing that's going to happen in a Southern Baptist worship service that's contrary to the United Methodist Church to the point that it would conflict with the discipline. What I couldn't do is have a Wiccan service in the church or something, not that I would ever want to, but I couldn't do that, right? So by discipline, if the minister allowed for that, that would be what is called a chargeable offense. And I'll explain what that means when we talk about the judicial council. So that's kind of how rites and ceremonies work in the church and how that's structured, where the authority is rested. And the reason for that, the reason that the United Methodist Church uses for placing the authority for the ordering of worship with the pastor is really very simply because the United Methodist Church believes that pastors, clergy are made up of people that are called by God, set apart from the congregation, affirmed by the congregation, and then sent away somewhere to learn how to do all that. So the belief is that if we're going to send somebody away to learn how to do it, we ought to have them come back and do it. And that's the idea of cooperation between clergy and laity is strong and profound in the United Methodist Church, and that is not always the case in other denominations. That is a distinctive. We believe very strongly in clergy and lay mutual participation in things, which is why, even though it's not mandated in the discipline, most clergy will put together a worship committee in their respective parishes. Yeah.
Has there been an example of a minister doing contrary, or a bishop coming down on a minister or a pastor?
Recently for ceremonies,
Like they were saying something crazy in the or something like that.
yes, there has been. I'm going to talk about structure in a minute, and I'm going to tell you that the discipline says that the General Conference is the only body that is given authority to speak for the denomination. Throughout the contention over homosexuality in the United Methodist Church, there have been, even in our conference, there have been clergy who fall on both sides of the debate. About a year, maybe a year and a half, no, it'd be longer than that, probably 2 or 3 years ago, there was a minister in Tulsa who sat down with a Tulsa newspaper, and he was interviewed, and the way he answered, now I don't know if he answered it this way or if the reporter wrote it this way, but he came across as if he were speaking on behalf of the denomination to the people that he agreed with. That made it to the bishop's desk, and he had to go before the bishop. I don't know how the bishop worked that out. I know that he got called into the bishop's office, and then the bishop was in the newspaper talking about what the Council of Bishops has said about all of that. That's the most recent issue in memory. Well, no, it's not true. The new bishop we have has made it very clear that clergy represent the church, and that if we put something on our social media accounts that does not represent the church well, we will be blessed to go before him and read what we wrote in front of him. Now, there are rumors about that having happened a couple of times already. So that kind of thing for sure. But you find that in a number of job fields. That's not something that bothers me. Police yourself. Good questions, though. Any others about that? Okay. Full communion? Yeah, there are a few. The Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, we went in full communion with them in the early 2000s. These are all actions of General Conference. The Episcopal Church, there's a proposal for full communion with the Episcopal Church right now, and it will probably be taken up by the 2020 General Conference. There are ongoing talks about full communion with the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church in its various forms, and the Church of England, which is a different body than the Episcopal Church. But those, I'm sure there are others. Those are the only ones I know about off the top of my head. And so there's an ecumenical office within the Council of Bishops that works on this, and they're having dialogue with almost every major faith group. There are pacts of full communion across what is called the Pan-Methodist spectrum. So the African Methodist Episcopal, African Methodist Episcopal Zion, the Wesleyan Church, churches like that. There are talks with the Southern Baptist Convention, but as to date, those talks haven't led us toward full communion yet. So that's what I know. Yeah.
It was just about the Episcopal Church.
Okay. Well, there's a proposal for it. Hadn't been adopted yet.
I'm just curious because didn't the Episcopal Church split about 10 years ago because of homosexuality?
They did. The Episcopal Church split. The conservative branch there was a conservative branch that formed that calls itself the Anglican Church in North America. The Episcopal Church would be considered a liberal church out of that split. And then
Not the former, it's the latter.
it is the Episcopal Church that has the Methodist Church and the Episcopal Church have worked on that proposal. Whether or not that gets approved is going to be completely related to how things work out in the United Methodist Church about homosexuality. That's
why I was
what's
curious, 'cause
that's what's holding off that approval right now. Yeah, good question. In fact, the Commission on the Way Forward has released information that they're talking about changing the structure of the United Methodist Church, and they haven't released details. They're saying they're going to try to figure out a way to do it without changing our Constitution. Because changing the Constitution requires a 2/3 vote of General Conference and a ratification of either 2/3 or 3/4 of all the annual conferences and central conferences. So they think they can come up with a proposal that doesn't change the Constitution. But what's been leaked so far is that they're talking about kind of a loose structure where there are different constituent bodies that fall under kind of one umbrella structure, which gives the different constituent bodies the opportunity, I guess, to tackle the issue of homosexuality as they see fit. But we haven't gotten any more information than that. I literally just told you everything that I've heard. So we're all kind of waiting with bated breath to see what comes out of that and how it goes, because it'll affect all of us for sure. They're supposed to get that report done sometime next year. It'll go before a special general conference in 2019. And then we have our regular general conference in 2020. So by then there should be information coming forward. Questions? Okay, let me talk to you about the structure. So because it is wicked boring, and I think we can probably get through it pretty quick, but it's important. The structure of the church is important, and really and I'm going to talk about this document. If you picked it up, if you didn't, that's absolutely fine, but I'm going to talk about this one. What is really, I think, most important to know about our structure is that we're connectional. And that's what you'll find at the front of this document. So in large part, you can break down churches into two basic kinds of church when you're talking about polity, how a church is structured. There are congregational churches and connectional churches. Churches with a congregational polity hold to the belief that the individual local church has authority to determine everything related to what the church will do. And if they are in relationship or the church word for that is always communion, which I think we just probably think sounds like holier or something than relationship. I don't know. But if they're in communion with other churches, it's usually through an association of some kind, which is a voluntary association that more often than not doesn't contain any kind of hierarchical authority. There's no hierarchical authoritarian relationship, i.e., the association could say, well, you don't believe what we believe, therefore you cannot be a part of our association. But the leader of the association cannot control what happens in the local church. So it's kind of a mutual group of shared beliefs, churches that have shared beliefs that will work together in mission, that will work together to affirm belief statements that would apply to the whole group of churches, but the leader has no authority over what happens in your church. In a connectional church, that's different. There is actually a formal hierarchy. And so for us, our structure looks like what you're going to see on the next page. There's some stats there if you want to see them about how many members we have. The General Conference is the largest structure, and it's what we would call the denomination. And it's an official structure. It's an official body. In fact, it is the only body, as I said a minute ago, that has the authority not only to speak for the church. I can speak for myself. I cannot speak for the United Methodist Church. Our bishop cannot speak for the United Methodist Church. Only the General Conference can issue statements for and on behalf of the United Methodist Church, and it meets every 4 years. Yeah. The bishop can speak for the bishop's opinion. That's it. There was a proposal like 2 general conferences back to create what we had jokingly called a United Methodist Archbishop, but it was like a bishop in charge of other bishops who could speak for the denomination between general conference sessions, and it got voted down handily. I didn't even have a chance of passing. And largely because when our discipline was originally written and constitution structured, there was a belief that we did not want one person with too much power deciding how the denomination would go. We wanted the lay people and the clergy to have a voting presence in a body that could make those decisions and also speak for the denomination. So the other part of that formula is that the General Conference is the only body that can make decisions that affect the denomination related to our doctrine and or our constitution. Therefore, our doctrine cannot change until General Conference changes it, period. Now General Conference meets every 4 years and they always meet in a different place. Below that, we have jurisdictional conferences, and those are in the United States. There's two kinds of conference structures right below the General Conference level. One is a jurisdictional conference, and the other is a central conference. And it's really semantic different. There are some structural difference, but primarily there's semantic differences. Central conferences are jurisdictions outside of the U.S., and jurisdictional conference are jurisdictions within the U.S. Because originally we weren't originally a U.S. church. Well, that's not true. The United Methodist Church is a U.S. church. The Methodist Church started in Britain. The Methodist Church is still in Britain. In fact, they've just entered a pact of full communion with the Church of England, and there's been a lot written in the last 2 months about how the Methodist Church may merge back with the Church of England, but the Methodist Church is still there. The United Methodist Church, which is also a Wesleyan descendant based on the people Wesley sent over here, is a U.S. church that grew outside of the U.S. and is now a worldwide church. So in the U.S., we have jurisdictions. Outside of the U.S., we have central conferences. Those are groupings of annual conferences. And like we're in the South Central jurisdiction. In large part, the most important duty of the jurisdictional conference is to elect bishops. That is where bishops are elected, and it is where bishops are assigned to regions. So for us, that kind of ensures that we're not going to get a bishop assigned to Oklahoma who came from Seattle or, well, no, we seem to get all of them from Texas. I think the last several bishops we've had have been from Texas. So, but it kind of helps to ensure that the bishops that oversee our conference are at least regionally affiliated with who we are demographically. Then below the jurisdictional central conferences, you have the annual conference. And that's what you hear us talk about the most in the church and from the pulpit. The annual conference, I think this talks about it as a geographical entity that is the fundamental body of the church, right? So the annual conference meets every year. We go to it every year. Each church has proportionate representation at annual conference. You have as many lay delegates as you have clergy delegates. So if we had another ordained elder on staff, then we would have 2 lay delegates who go to annual conference. We in the United Methodist Church, we just believe pretty strongly in that balance. The annual conference can make decisions about what the annual conference will do regarding practical matters. So we can start missions and ministries and close churches and open churches. And what we can't do at the annual conference level is decide what we're going to adopt as doctrine in the United Methodist Church. That is reserved for General Conference. So the annual conference is really an entity that deals with the practical organization of the church. Pensions and health benefits for clergy and annual conference employees are handled at the annual conference level. What happens to the local church is handled at the annual conference level. So if our church closes, right, then we're going to... Yeah, I heard that happens from time to time in Oklahoma. I hear no tornado sirens, so I'm going to continue on. The annual conference, if we were to close our church, for whatever the reason we couldn't keep it open, there would not be, the church council, let me say it this way, would not sell the property and dispose of it and then figure out what to do with the funds. The district would come in on behalf of the annual conference and sell the property. Those funds would go to the district. One of the most important educational opportunities in any church. I was just at Marlowe, and Marlowe had about $1.7 million in endowment funds that the church had worked with. Now, they had been amassing those endowment funds ever since they were in financial difficulty. When they were in financial difficulty, they decided that they were going to have some endowment funds. And that was great. They grew their endowment funds, and they were terrified of using them. And so we ended up having conversations about how it's important that we have that balance. I mean, we don't want to just spend money just for the sake of spending money. But at the same time, there have been many churches, many, not a few, many, that will close because they didn't make use of their endowment funds to keep the church open. And then those endowment funds go to the district. And the district ends up using those endowment funds however the district deems appropriate. Now, that's been great for us. Because that happened in other churches, I went to the district together with David Rogers, and I said, hey, we'd really love to have some of that money so that we can make some ministry happen. And they said, okay. The issue with that is that when we give money to an endowment, we kind of give it for a purpose. We want it to be used for what we've given it for. When it goes to the district, it's going to be used for whatever the district wants to use it for. So in large part, it's always a good idea to make use of those funds as a church as best you can if you're struggling to keep the doors of the church open. So we have annual conference that deal with the practical issues of the church. In the United Methodist Church, we don't own our building. Well, we kind of do. We have a very complicated trust clause. So we are responsible for the building unless we close or decide we don't want to be Methodist anymore. If we decide we don't want to be United Methodist, that's fine. But according to the discipline, our property goes back to the United Methodist Church. Now, there have been more than one church more than one local church that has taken their annual conference to court to try to get their property. This just happened in Mississippi, and they ended up not having to go to court. The annual conference voted to release the property to the church that wanted to leave the denomination because this was a huge church, and they were concerned that if they took the property on with no people, there'd be an awful lot of debt that they wouldn't be able to cover. So the annual conference can make the decision to do that too. So that is the kind of thing the annual conference does. We also, as an annual conference, we have annual conference level ministry. We have denomination level ministries, and we have annual conference level ministries, and we even have a few jurisdictional conference ministries. So things like Circle of Care, Skyline Urban Ministry, the redemption ministry program to prison ministries here in the state. Those are all annual conference level ministries. We have a ministry to some of the impoverished Cherokee population in Cookson Hills, Oklahoma, which is near Tahlequah. That is a general church. That's a general conference level ministry that's happening here in Oklahoma. So there are different levels of ministry. Every time I hear a large megachurch, congregational megachurch, talk about all of the wonderful things they're doing in ministry, I always rejoice over that. But I also rejoice that the United Methodist Church in its totality is doing profound things. And that's what our apportionments pay for. Our apportionments pay for large-scale ministries in the annual conference and around the world, and we're doing a lot. So then below the annual conference, we have the charge conference or the local church, which are very similar. We also have a charge conference every year. It's where we conduct the business of the church. And we have a structure of committees in the church, each of which are responsible for different things. So we have a church council that is responsible for making certain decisions in the church. There are some decisions that only the trustees can make because the trustees are the official body of our 501c3 status. The trustees are also responsible for the endowments of the church according to the Book of Discipline. And then there are, decisions that finance can make and decisions that SBR can make. And then the Book of Discipline says there are some committees that you can have if you want them, but don't have to. So all of that is written into the Book of Discipline, kind of at the local church level for how we deem it most appropriate to run our church. That's kind of the big structure of the church. Now, within that, if you turn the page over, you're also there's a little more information about General Conference, but we also have this Council of Bishops. The Council of Bishops don't have authority to make decisions for the denomination, but from a corporate perspective, you could see them as the presiding officer of any meeting that we have, who has authority in most circumstances to issue a ruling on matters of polity or practice. So at the annual conference, somebody may get up and say, according to the discipline, can we take this procedure? Say we're going to have a vote on pension, and somebody decides they want to take a particular path with the debate. Well, it will be the bishop who makes a ruling on how we do that. And then the Council of Bishops also oversee and encourage the ministries of the local church, and they're the direct supervisors of the district superintendents and of the clergy. In the United Methodist Church, the ordained clergy are not members of their local church. Ordained clergy hold membership in the annual conference. So the annual conference is the equivalent of my church. I don't have membership here. My membership is there, which is why I serve on annual conference boards and committees like I would in a local church if I were a member of the local church. We have a judicial council that is made up of, I don't know what the proportion is, but clergy and lay representatives. Almost all, if not all, of our lay reps to the Judicial Council are practicing attorneys in the state of Oklahoma, not native state of Oklahoma, around the country. They meet, I believe, annually. I think it's every spring, to deal with charges that are brought before them from around the connection. So if a minister is charged with something, and there's a whole list of chargeable offenses for clergy in the back of the Book of Discipline. You would not believe this, but there's a whole list of chargeable offenses for laity in the back of the Book of Discipline. The first time I ever saw that, I was like, wow. And then my second thought was, I wonder if anybody's ever actually charged a layperson with something. Because, I mean, you ought to read through it. I mean, the charges they're sobering. I mean, they're things like not regularly participating in worship and stuff like that. And so I'm reading through this, and I'm like, if I were a layperson and you charged me with this, I'd just be like, I'll see you at the next church I go to. But they're in there. It's in there. So there's chargeable offenses. Now, clergy do get charged with things. And the first level that you will go to, the first person to hear those charges will be the bishop. The bishop will make a determination, and if it goes past that, it can make it to the judicial council. So they'll come up with a ruling. All of these clergy who have officiated same-sex marriages, while it has not been the polity and doctrine of the church to allow that, have been charged and have had to go before the Judicial Council, with the exception of a recent ruling that there's a moratorium on that until 2019. So that's what the Judicial Council does. I promised you that that would be riveting. Do you have any questions about how the structure of the church works?
Is there stuff that's mandated to go before the judicial council? Or can it all go through the bishop first? The bishop's like, well, I don't want to touch this. Go to the judicial, or is it?
Any charge against a bishop goes straight to the Judicial Council, in my understanding. I'd have to read everything else off the top. Now, the bishop, there are certain charges that the bishop has authority to rule on, and certain charges that the bishop does not. And I'd have to read through the Book of Discipline but it clearly tells you what the difference is when you look at it.
And like, so like if you were, I don't know, if you were convicted of something in like court, not the Methodist court, but like
in
like you got
legal
charged with,
court.
like domestic abuse or something.
Okay.
That's the only thing I come to mind.
Sure.
Would that be taken before the judicial council, or that would be handled separately, and then you would be disciplined by the church?
Okay, so that's a good question. How do secular legal matters work their way into the church? First, there has to be a charge brought against the minister, and that can be brought against the minister by a member of the church, baptized professing member of the church, or by another clergy person or a district superintendent or a bishop. My suspicion, I don't know, I can't think of any examples, but my suspicion would be that there are certain things you could be convicted of that the DS or the bishop would naturally bring charges against you for. But that's just my assumption. Just because you go in front of a secular court doesn't mean you're automatically going to go in front of the Judicial Council. There's leeway, and there have to be charges brought. You've heard me say over and over again that rebaptizing is a chargeable offense for a minister. So if I rebaptize somebody, maybe that nobody in the congregation chose to charge me, but our experience in the United Methodist Church has been that there's always someone who will charge you for something like that. So that's a good question. What else? What other questions do you have? There is. I don't know the details of the appeal process off the top of my head, but there is an appeal process. Yeah. Good question. In fact, a lot of the ministers who have been brought before the Judicial Council for officiating same-sex marriage have also looked for ways to appeal. There's a couple of them I'm aware of off the top of my head that have appealed. I don't think those appeals have ever been brought to fruition because the policy of the United Methodist Church is very clear about that. So it's usually shot down. Yeah.
How do you get to be a bishop?
How do you get to be a bishop? Okay. There are different types of clergy in the United Methodist Church, but we have always maintained that bishops are of the same order, the word is order, as elders. So our bishops are elders who have been elected to serve as a bishop.
Well, that's what I wonder. What level, what
Yep. At the jurisdictional level, which is a grouping of conferences, they will run, and it's very much like any other political race. They spend a lot of money running to become bishops, and they give a lot of speeches, and they travel a lot to trying to connect with delegates. It's real political, and they end up getting elected. And then the jurisdictional conference, there is a college of bishops for the denomination, and then there's a college of bishops for the jurisdictional conference, and that college of bishops and the jurisdictional conference will be a part of the process of determining where the bishop is appointed. But they're elected at the jurisdictional conference level. They go to something that they all affectionately call Bishop Charm School, which is like 2 or 3 weeks long, to give them a crash course in bishoping, and then they come back and start serving as bishops. But they're all elected. Now, district superintendents, who are also elders, are appointed. The bishop of an annual conference appoints elders to serve as district superintendents. That's what happened to Connie. Connie is an elder, just like I'm an elder. The bishop always confers with the cabinet. It is the bishop who has appointive authority. But the cabinet, which consists of the bishop and the district superintendents and the bishop's assistant, they all confer with the bishop, and the bishop relies heavily on their input about where to appoint clergy in the annual conference. We're appointed in the annual conference. So if our annual conference is the state of Oklahoma, we're appointed within the boundaries of the annual conference. The Great Plains Annual Conference consists of the states of Kansas and Nebraska. So you can be appointed anywhere in Kansas or Nebraska in the Great Plains Annual Conference. There's like 5 conferences in Texas, so you're not going to be appointed across the state of Texas. You're going to be appointed within your annual conference. But it's the bishop who has appointive authority. So typically, the bishop does not confer with anybody before the bishop selects a district superintendent. The bishop selects district superintendents and then shares with the cabinet who the new DSs will be to replace the DSs who are going off. And then they all work together to make appointments. Good question. Yeah. The bishop is a lifelong appointment, and there have been petitions put before General Conference repeatedly to stop that, and they always get voted down. District superintendents are not. They usually serve officially at the pleasure of the bishop, which is usually 6 years. Normally, the pleasure of the bishop lasts about 6 years. So there have been some who have served longer, and sometimes they'll come off early if there is an appointment. So the district superintendents will submit names for an appointment. When they sit around, and this comes from Dad, he was a DS for 4 or 5 years. They sit around their table, they look at every church, and they look at every clergy person. So those profiles that we turn in about our church that the SPRC does every year, those go in front of the cabinet, and the cabinet looks at that and looks at every clergy person. They talk about each, it takes them a really long time. They talk about each church, they take a break, and during the break, the DSs are allowed to write names of clergy that they think would be a good fit for that church. Sometimes during the break, one of the DS's names will get written up there, and they'll talk about that too. So usually it's 6 years. No. No, absolutely not. This is online. I affirm the bishop's position. I think it's a necessary position, but it's totally administrative. I know bishops preach a lot. I know they do a lot of ministry, but they don't do ministry in a local church. They do ministry in an annual conference. I want to preach and teach and do pastoral care and serve the sacraments. So, no. And the good thing, if you're asked to be a DS, typically ministers can say no. We can say no to the appointment. But the bishop can also come back and say, well, if you want an appointment, this is the appointment that you can have. But it's also kind of an unwritten rule that if you say no to an appointment, your next appointment that you're offered is likely to not be a very good appointment. So we're supposed to not say no to the appointment. We're supposed to take any appointment that's offered to us. And there are many of us who believe strongly in that, and I'm one who does. Good questions. Let me tell you some before we get out. Oh, yeah, sure. Oh, it's a good question. Can you move from one conference to another? Yes, you can, but you've got to, we are a church, right? We're not a business, but we have practices we have to follow in order to appropriately order the business of the church, right? One of those practices is that we don't want clergy just calling up other annual conferences and, job hunting. So the practice is that you got to talk to your DS and bishop. Your bishop has to talk to the bishop of the other annual conference. And if there is a good fit, then the bishop of the other annual conference will invite you to come and visit with their cabinet. That's typically how that works. That happened with my dad. He had been in what was then the Kansas East Conference for 20 years. And his dissertation supervisor was from his doctorate, became the senior pastor at Tulsa First and wanted Dad. So he went to the bishop and said, I want this man. And the bishop contacted the other bishop, and that bishop contacted Dad, and now we're in Oklahoma. So that's kind of how that worked. But good question. Let me share with you how the clergy appointive system and what the ordination process looks like in the United Methodist Church. And please keep asking questions. These are good ones. I figured if you came out on the stormy night, then you must really want to know about the structure of the church and the ordination process. So I want to get all your questions answered. So I'm going to talk about this, which is something you can look at that kind of gives you an idea about what the different kinds of clergy are. And what the ordination process is. So we have, because we're connectional, the local church, the congregation doesn't ordain us. That can be a practice in some congregational churches where the congregation will select you for a job and then ordain you. But in a connectional church, it typically doesn't happen that way. We have denominational standards and processes for ordination, and it is the bishop who ordains us. Why? Because in a lot of the mainline / old line churches, we kind of believe that something called apostolic succession is important. That means that we believe that being ordained by someone who can trace their ordination back to Peter and subsequently Christ is important for the continuity of the church. In fact, this new bishop has started to do something that is really cool for the new ordinands. He just did it. This last year was his first year to ordain anybody. He started to present them with certificates that trace their ordination back to Wesley and then from Wesley back to Peter, which is just a neat thing to have. So we're ordained by bishops. There are different kinds of clergy. We have local pastors and deacons and elders. Local pastors, deacons, and elders are all considered to be clergy. They fall under that category of clergy. And there's blurps in here about each of them if you want to know more about them. Local pastors have developed really out of necessity. They are not ordained. Local pastors are not ordained, but they serve, and the language again is at the pleasure of the bishop, because we don't have enough ordained clergy to serve in all of the churches we have, and we need people to serve in those churches. So the United Methodist Church created this category of people who don't go to seminary. They can, anybody can go to seminary, but typically local pastors don't go to seminary. They participate in something that is called the course of study, which is kind of like a certificate program. It's usually run by the seminaries and covers some core theological issues, but it is much less involved and much shorter than a graduate degree program. So they're ordained. You'll see they're licensed, not ordained, licensed to word, sacrament, and service. Every year we run a class called Local Pastors Licensing School. It happens at Oklahoma City University, lasts 2 weeks, and it is basically a crash course in ministry. When you serve as it's called a licensed local pastor, once you complete that course and you're voted on by the Board of Ordained Ministry, and I'll explain that in a minute, then you can be appointed. You get a license for ministry signed by the bishop, and you can be appointed to a local church. That license is good for you to practice ministry in that local church, which means that you can oversee the sacraments within that congregation. You can, to some degree, you can order the life of the church. And you can perform weddings and funerals. In the state of Oklahoma, the local pastor's license is good enough to perform weddings and funerals. In some states, that's not the case. So the licensed local pastor operates in the church under the direct authority and supervision of the district superintendent. So it's kind of like anything that the licensed local pastor does or does not do falls on the shoulders of the district superintendent, who supervises all of that as if it were the district superintendent's own church and ministry. Licensed local pastors can consecrate the elements for communion, and they can oversee and administer baptisms, but they are only authorized by the bishop to do that in their context, and really out of necessity, because we don't have enough people to do that. There are a lot of licensed local pastors in the United Methodist Church, and that is largely because the decline of the church since the 1960s has reduced the size of congregations. Equitable compensation rates for United Methodist clergy for full-time service are like either $39,000 or $40,000 a year for full-time. That's the basic level full-time pay rate for a United Methodist clergy person. There are a lot of churches that can't afford that. So they end up not being able to afford elders. We don't have enough elders. So they hire licensed local pastors who are overseen by the district superintendents. Yeah.
Is that salary also parsonage?
No, no. The salary package doesn't include the parsonage. So it would be that salary rate plus a parsonage or plus a housing allowance if there's no parsonage provided by the church. It's a good question. The next level of ordination would be the deacon. Most churches have deacons. Now, for a connectional church, a deacon is an ordained position. For a congregational church, it is usually a lay position. So if you've come from a background where you had a board of deacons or something like that, and you're thinking, I'm not used to that being an ordained position, that's because that's the normal practice for a congregational church. For a connectional church, it's usually an ordained position. So if you came from a Roman Catholic background, you will have had ordained deacons in your church, and in the Anglican, all those churches. And a deacon is ordained to, used to be word and service, and I think they've added word, service, and justice now, I believe. Deacons do not itinerate. They can have a Master of Divinity, but they must have a master's degree. So if it's not a Master of Divinity, then they must have a master's degree in their field, plus about 27 hours of basic theological education. That is required for ordination for a deacon. Deacons will not itinerate, and they will never be the senior pastor of a church. So typically a deacon will serve either on staff as an associate pastor dedicated to an area of ministry. We have a lot of deacons in the United Methodist Church who specialize in children's ministry, youth ministry, business administration, and mission. There's a lot of people in those categories, and they'll focus entirely on that. They are ordained clergy members of the United Methodist Church, but they don't have the authority to consecrate the elements, for instance. They can officiate weddings, they can officiate at funerals, they can preach, and they can teach, and they can lead the church in mission and justice. And the discipline says that they are to assist the elders in the sacraments, but they're not to consecrate them, with the exception of what the discipline calls special circumstances. So,
Was there
yeah.
a different name for deacon?
Are you thinking of diaconal ministers? Okay.
I couldn't think of it.
There used to be a category for lay ministry called diaconal ministers, and they were not ordained. The United Methodist Church did away with that in the late 90s, early 2000s. But there are still some diaconal people who were diaconal ministers who are still in service, but we're not doing that anymore.
We had a diaconal here doing
Oh, okay.
children's.
Okay, good. Yeah, we had a diaconal minister in the church I grew up in. I don't know why the church stopped doing that. I just know that they did. The deacon will find his or her own job, and they also serve sometimes in extension ministries. They'll serve in hospice care. Sometimes they'll serve as chaplains, but they will find their own job. So in our church, the SPRC would interview and hire the deacon, and once we have hired the deacon, the bishop would then retroactively appoint the deacon here. So the bishop still makes the appointment, but the deacon is not itinerant. The bishop will never come down and say, you've got to move from this church to this church. So the deacon, if the deacon wants to move, the deacon will always have to find his or her own job somewhere. Then we have elders, and elders are probably what you're most familiar with in the United Methodist Church. That is what I am. It's what Connie was, still is. It's what Connie is. It's what both of the Scots who have come out of this church are. So it's probably what you're most familiar with. The word elder is an English translation of the word presbyter, which is used by some other connectional denominations to talk about the same office. Elders are ordained to word, service, sacrament, and order. And that means we are ordained to preach and to order the life of the church for mission and ministry. Politically, logistically, corporately, we are the chief officer of the church. We are ordained to administer the sacraments and to lead the church and order the church for mission and ministry. So in order to be an elder, you have to have a Master of Divinity in addition to whatever bachelor's degree you have. Master of Divinity is a seminary degree. So when you hear anybody in the church talk about seminary, seminary is the graduate school that offers theological education. Sometimes they stand alone. Sometimes they're a part of a university structure like a law school or a medical school would be. The Master of Divinity is an accredited degree accredited by all of each of the regional accrediting agencies that accredit universities and graduate schools. It's also got to be accredited by the Association for Theological Schools, which says, I think, that in order to be accredited, the degree has to be 72 hours of graduate study. Mine was 96. I went to Asbury in Kentucky. So it is a long master's degree. It's usually 4 years full-time. Sometimes people get it done in 3. So you have to get a Master of Divinity. And when you are finished with the Master of Divinity, then whether you are a deacon who has a master's degree plus the hours of theological ed or an elder, then you apply to your local Board of Ordained Ministry. First, if you want to be a minister, you will talk to your minister, and your minister will take you through a process to help you discern whether or not you're called to that. Not for the minister to discern for you, but to help you discern whether or not God is calling you to that. Then you will talk with your local SPR, and they will help you to discern that, and they will vote to recommend you to the church conference or the charge conference. Then the charge conference will vote on you, and then you will go to the district committee on ministry, and the district level committee on ministry, which is made up of clergy and laity, will interview you, will require you to submit some documents, all of that while you are working on your formal theological education. Once you finish your formal theological education, for most people that's somewhere between 3 and 6 years, then you will apply from your district committee to go before the conference's Board of Ordained Ministry. Think of that like any other professional licensing group that you are aware of. It's the responsibility of the Board of Ordained Ministry to determine whether or not a person is ready for ordination. They vote on that person, and then the bishop they vote on the person. Their vote is a recommendation that goes before the clergy session of the annual conference. The clergy vote on whether or not to ordain you, and then the bishop will do that.
So the bishop doesn't actually make the decision to ordain you?
No, bishop doesn't make the decision. Now, any bishop could refuse to do so, but it's the annual conference that makes a decision to do that. There is another document that you have that shows what the process for what is called provisional membership is for deacons and elders. The Book of Discipline mandates that be a 2-year process. For us, it had been a 3-year process. I chair the committee that is called the Provisional Committee on the Board of Ordained Ministry here in Oklahoma. We were asked by the bishop and the executive committee to change that to a 2-year process. So what you have before you is actually what I've been working on with my committee for the last year. I wrote that, and it was just adopted a couple of months ago, so we're transitioning into that process right now. But basically, whether you are a deacon or an elder, when you've finished your theological education and you've been interviewed by the district committee on ministry, and some of those interviews are very direct, you apply to go before the Board of Ordained Ministry to be what we call commissioned. You are commissioned into provisional membership. You will submit a sermon and a Bible study and answer a 28-page doctrinal question statement. That'll all go before the Board of Ordained Ministry. You go before the board and you interview with 3 separate committees, one on doctrine and polity, and one on worship and teaching, and one on the call and discipline life, which deals with a very, very in-depth psychological evaluation that you undergo. All of those interviews are 45 minutes apiece, and they're also very direct. If you pass those interviews, then the board will vote on you to be commissioned. If you are commissioned, then you become a provisional member for 2 years. You have the same rights as a licensed local pastor. You can administer the sacraments in your congregation if you're an elder, not if you're a deacon. You serve in a local church, and for some people, that's the first time they've ever served in that role in a church. So it's usually for most a small church, small kind of a rural setting. Through those 2 years, you'll go through what you have before you. Every year, you submit a series of documents, a sermon and sermon evaluations from your congregation, and a Bible study and evaluations. In year 2, you submit another doctrinal statement, and the board. I sit on the interview team that is doctrine and polity, and we take that 28-page doctrinal statement and look for anything that falls outside of the United Methodist umbrella. And when you think about that, what people always bristle up a little bit. Who are you to determine whether or not God's calling me to ministry? More often than not, what we determine is that somebody's either not ready or psychologically they're not fit. I tell you more than one. We're not. It is a difficult interview, but it's a difficult interview because it's intimate and direct. We have had the opportunity to help people figure out that they need to get some psychological help for some major issues that they're dealing with. That's helped them to heal. So we're all ministers, so it's very much a ministry process when we go through that. But you're gonna do that for 2 years, and if you pass your year 1 interviews and you pass your year 2 interviews, then the board will vote on you, and you'll go back before the clergy session of the annual conference. They'll vote on you, and then the bishop will ordain you. That's kind of how the process works.
What do you mean by direct?
When you sit down for a conversation with somebody that you don't know, there are unwritten rules of decorum. When you sit down for an interview like this, we will ask you direct questions about why you believe what you believe and make you articulate that. And if you can't articulate that, we'll probe it and try to figure out why. Partly because we want to see if you do understand it and you just can't verbalize it very well, and partly because there are very few circumstances in your time as a church leader where you will not be put in uncomfortable leadership situations over and over and over and over again. And we want to make sure you can handle that. We end up with more trouble with clergy over their inability to lead well than we ever do over theological issues. So we need to be able to see how you handle yourself in an uncomfortable situation, whether or not you can do that appropriately. So we are direct on purpose to try to create that environment a little bit to see how you'll be able to respond. And then there are other issues that come up. Sometimes personal issues come up. The bishop has said that anything on your Facebook page is fair game. And so people have contacted the Board of Ordained Ministry and said, this is on this person's Facebook page. When you're a minister, there are things you covenant not to do. There's not a group of clergy. The Board of Ordained Ministry doesn't run around and try to figure out if you're doing that. But if it gets brought to the attention of the board, then the board has no choice but to deal with that. So there is also a group on the Board of Ordained Ministry that deals with those kinds of clergy issues. Good questions. Okay. We're about 5 minutes after 7, and you guys have asked great questions. I hope I've helped you to understand things better. Some of our polity is ridiculously complex, but anytime you're talking about a very large organization, you're going to have some complex rules about how to manage that organization. Doesn't matter whether it's a church or anything else. There was one point in our national history where the United Methodist Church had the largest pension fund of any organization in America. That's how big we are. Last I heard, and this would have been 10 years ago, we were the second largest. So we're a large organization. And because of that, there are some complex rules born out of necessity, usually difficult circumstances that deal with why we have all the rules and regulations. Any other questions before we let you go? Okay. Yeah. Okay, so he said we don't have as many elders. And why is that? In part, it's because across the denomination, the average age of our elders had been gradually increasing because we had a lot of elders from the boomer generation, and they started to retire about 2 years ago, and they're retiring in very large numbers now. And we're not getting enough people in to replace them. There was a time in American history where if you wanted to make a difference in the world, you became a minister. That changed when we started to litigate so many things to if you want to make a difference in the world, you become a lawyer. So we have fewer, and I'm not trying to be disparaging, we just have fewer people coming into ministry. Ministry is also a long process. Seminary is expensive and salaries are not high. We're also being ordained into a denomination that's been in decline since the 1960s. So when you're looking at job prospects, you really have to be called into ministry in order to be there. The other issue is that boards of ordained ministry have become more strict because we hear from the local churches about problems with clergy leadership. So I would tell you, and don't hold me to this, but on average, over the last few years, we've probably had 2/3 pass rate, maybe. There was a time in our history when we just kind of rubber stamped people, and we don't do that anymore. So that probably has something to do with it as well. Other questions? Okay. Well, I want to thank you for braving the storm to come out and learn about the structure and polity of the United Methodist Church. But I believe that it's helpful, especially if you have never been through confirmation. It's good to know how the church that you're a part of structures itself, what those processes are. Yeah, there's the storm. Sun has come out. All right, friends, if you don't mind, let me pray a prayer of blessing over you, and then we'll break for the evening. Almighty God, we are so grateful for the opportunity that you've given us to come together tonight to learn more about the part of the body of Christ that we are a part of. God, we know that no structure is going to be perfect. No structure is going to perfectly enable us to share the good news. And yet we also know that structure is necessary when we manage large groups of people. So we pray, God, that you would help us to live into that structure in a way that's meaningful, to make use of the structure in a way that's meaningful, so that we can be in effective ministry together in this place that you've called us together. God, we just pray for that in your holy name. Amen. Thanks for coming.